Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to SABEW's Legends of Business News Conversation Series. I'm Caleb Silver, the editor-in-chief of Investopedia and the past president of SABEW. Delighted, so delighted to have you with us. We're especially delighted to have you with us to celebrate the brilliant career of Allan Sloan, and we thank you for your membership and for your support. Since it's Giving Tuesday, we ask that you think of SABEW and your giving plans this year. Please help support continued excellence in business journalism. That's what we're all about. It's easy to donate. Go to sabew.org to donate. It's Giving Tuesday. I did it this morning. I feel great about that. I did it, in celebration of tonight's conversation series, and I'm so excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. Allan Sloan has been writing about business news for almost 50 years. He has won too many business journalism awards to mention, and like Elvis, he's had to build a separate house in Brooklyn so he could store them all. He's won SABEW's Distinguished Achievement Award back in 2001, multiple Best in Business News Awards, 7 Loeb Awards in 4 different categories, including a Lifetime Achievement Awards, over 5 different decades for 5 different employers. That's what sports writers call a dynasty and a Hall of Fame career. At SABEW, we call it a legendary career. Allan has worked at the Charlotte Observer, the Detroit Free Press, Forbes twice, Money Magazine, Newsday twice, Newsweek, Fortune, ProPublica, and the Washington Post, where he is currently a columnist. He is a graduate of Brooklyn College and the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And he's going to get more into Allan's distinguished career, but beyond the awards and the accolades is the legacy of outstanding reporting he has done for over 5 decades, and the laughter and joy he has brought to hundreds of colleagues along the way. Allan's own laugh is unmistakable, and it's actually in the Laugh Hall of Fame. People who have had the great fortune of working with Allan, there you go, describe him as relentlessly curious, doggedly persistent, and someone who enjoys the thrill of chasing down a great story and finding the most simple and purest ways of explaining it to readers. I was lucky enough to work with Allan at Fortune on a few video series in the past, but no one had a better front row seat than Andy Serwer, the former editor-in-chief of Fortune. One day, Andy's going to be sitting in that legend seat, just like Allan, and somebody's going to be interviewing him, just like we did with Carol and Myron. But today, we're fortunate to have Andy interview Allan on his brilliant career. Take it away, Captain.
Thank you very much, Caleb. That's for those kind words for Allan, because this is all about Allan Sloan. Hi, Allan. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Andy. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. We're going to keep having you squirm a little bit because in addition to those kind remarks that Caleb just made, I want to add a few things to that. First of all, I'm just so delighted to be interviewing Allan for this event. A, because he's so deserving, but B, I've just had such a great time working with Allan for all the success he had. It was just thrilling to be working with him, just in a part of his career. And then also hanging out with him while we were working together and before, during, and after, because he is just a lot of fun. I think you can make a strong case that Allan is the GOAT of business journalism, as voted by his peers. You know, those 7 Loeb Awards, I think, and that's his peers, and I think that's more than anyone else has won. I tried to go back, Allan, and look. I saw someone with 6, but I think 7 is number 1. And just to give you an idea, you know, they always call these the Oscars of business journalism. So I went to the Oscars, right? The person with the most Oscars, male actor, females, Katharine Hepburn. We'll stay with men here. Just so is Jack Nicholson with 3, right? So you're way ahead of him. So Jack Nicholson won 3, Denzel Washington won 2, and Robert De Niro won 2. So basically, Allan is like Jack Nicholson, Denzel Washington, and Robert De Niro combined. That's the way I like to think of him. And he's sort of, you know, if you think about it, you squint your eyes a little bit, you can see that in him. You know, we get this laughter and all that, but one thing I should tell you is that Allan also has the strongest journalistic instincts of anyone I've ever worked with. And Allan will not back down or pull punches on anyone. He is 100% not afraid. And he relishes going into battle. And, you know, a lot of people say that about other people, but I can tell you firsthand that that is really true about Allan. So again, I'm delighted. I want to ask you, Allan, about the Sloan origin story and all that good stuff, because there's so many great chapters. But maybe we'll just start at the end first with your most recent Turkeys column. which I always love, where you wrote about Sam Bankman-Fried and Elon Musk. You also outed yourself as a non-cannabis user. I mean, come on, you out, right? In that column. And what my question is, Allan, are these guys, these controversial figures, bad guys in some instances, SBF and Elon Musk, are they the same as they've been, the same people over this long career? Or are there different things about these guys? Is it a plus ça change, or is it very different?
Well, SBF, whom I don't know and don't want to know, he's I think 30 years old. He's had an amazing rise and fall, and one of the stranger things about him is he seems to have been, while he was alive, or at least while he was functional, left wing. So he was making all sorts of donations to the Democrats and various left-leaning organizations, and you don't see that very often. And Elon Musk, who seems obsessed with the number 420. He paid $54.20 a share for Twitter. A few years ago, when he made up some idiotic story that he was taking Tesla private, it was going to be at $4.20 a share. And I always figured those were jokes, tied to cannabis. And so I figured as long as I was mentioning that 420 was cannabis, I would mention that I didn't use it. I'm not looking for any prizes, but it seemed relevant, so I threw it in because it also felt like fun.
Yeah. Are they the same bad guys or crazy people, though, that you saw all those decades ago? Or are these guys different, you think?
I think, Bankman-Fried, his social orientation is different.
Right.
But he seems like, a sort of grasping bad guy smiling at everybody. And Elon Musk, whom I have to say I've never understood, is exactly the kind of person I'd love to dig into deeply if I was still working at a place like Fortune with a newsroom and editors and people I could cooperate with. I would love to hear the true Elon Musk origin story because I don't know it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of journalists working on that, no doubt. So let's get back to the beginning then. And were you, was the 5-year-old Allan Sloan tugging at his mother's sleeve and saying, well, Susie wants to be a doctor and Jimmy wants to be a fireman, so I want to be a business journalist?
Oh,
was that
God,
how it happened?
no, God, no. What happened was I go off to Brooklyn College, which I went to because the price was right, which was nothing. And it was a meritocracy. So I got in because I had good grades and good boards. And I went in, thought I was going to be a math major. That lasted until my first math class, which I dropped. Then by accident, I ended up in the English class of not the one that wasn't assigned to me, of the fellow who named Loeb, may he rest in peace, who was the editor, the advisor to the paper. And I read the paper. I said, this is just crap. Anybody can do better than this. And he said, prove it. I said, okay. So I went to the paper. I'd never written anything. I never cared about journalism, but I really liked it when I got there and ended up becoming editor-in-chief, which was sort of fun. And then when I graduated, there was this thing called the Vietnam War. Do you remember that?
I do.
Well, so my choice was graduate school or the Vietnam War. I chose graduate school, and Columbia was the cheapest one, and it was 1 year instead of 2 years. So I went there and graduated there, and then there's more stuff that we can get into later. But that's my origin story.
All right.
It was a total accident.
Yeah, and so, well, let's just keep going then, because, did you consider being an art critic? Were you going to be a sports writer? Did you want to be a foreign correspondent? Now you narrowed it down.
Well, what happened was I did a tryout at a paper called Newsday, which you may have heard of in Long Island, and I failed the tryout. But I met this woman who's sitting right near me, to whom I've been married now for 53 years, who is going, if we had saints in our religion, she would be one. She's put up with me for 53 years.
Yeah.
And then after we decided we were an item, the Army drafted me and I failed the induction physical.
Mm.
And since I was unemployable in New York, I called the Columbia Journalism School. I said, what is there on the East Coast that's reasonably respectable? And they said, Charlotte needs sports writers. I said, fine, I'll be a sports writer.
So you were a sports writer.
So I go to Charlotte, and I sort of didn't fit in there very well. I had long hair, this accent. Charlotte was this little place in 1968 or 69 when I got there. And Nancy and I are getting married, and sports writers work nights and weekends, and Nancy taught French. So I said, I want a job that's a Monday to Friday job. So they made me the real estate reporter, which I knew nothing about. And that ultimately morphed into being the banking reporter and the utilities reporter. And along the way, I kept learning things because I was always good at arithmetic. And a bunch of people in Charlotte, despite my alien nature, decided I was okay. And they decided to teach me. They except for Nancy, they were the most patient people on earth. So I ended up, doing this thing in working for a great editor who also has passed, named George Fry, who was very patient, and ultimately the staff of two. And, I learned how to do stuff.
Yeah. What was the newsroom like back then? I mean, first of all, I don't know what the sports reporters were covering, because this is way before the Charlotte Hornets or anything. I mean, but what was the environment like? I mean, there were manual typewriters.
There were manual typewriters. I hate smoke. Smoking. People were smoking. People were screaming. People are running around. It's like those bad movies. I mean, that's what it was. And I'm very good at screaming. I'm very good at running around. I never smoked, thank God.
You're like this.
Oh no, it was awful. And I'd come home and I'd have to change because my underwear stank of smoke.
Wow.
But there was a change of regime at the paper. George left, and he was a religious fellow, a Baha'i, and went off to work for the Baha'i church. And his replacement and I didn't get along. And to give you the very short version of it, I ended up, I got a job offer from Baltimore. And somebody from the business side of the Charlotte Observer was going off to become business editor in Detroit. He said, why don't you come to Detroit? I said, okay. So we went to Detroit.
So it doesn't sound like there was this real master plan where, okay, I'm going to start at a regional newspaper, then I'm going to get to New York and work at one of these big magazines, and then I'm going to, become a big wheel in business journalism.
No, there was no plan at all. I was just, living this from day to day. We decided early that I would be the financial, after we started to have children in Detroit, we said, I will be the financial person. My wife will be the house person. I'll figure out some way to pay for it.
Right.
And I figured out some way to pay for it.
But
there was no master plan.
But also, I mean, you said yourself you're good at math. I know that for a fact, from many stories, working on stories with you. So you could have gone into banking. Especially as you got sort of closer to it as a business journalist. We've seen people, go to the dark side or the other side. If you had to support your family, did you ever consider going into business?
No, because I knew what it took. You had to be extremely disciplined. You had to kiss butt. You had to smile a lot. And I can do it if I have to, but I didn't really want to have to. And I figured out some way to make it work. And it all went reasonably well for a long time. But then my wife and I are both from New York. We have little kids. we decided we wanted our children to see their grandparents while they were still alive, and nobody in New York would touch me. I'd won this Loeb Award for writing about utility rates. You tell me how many people have ever won a Loeb for that.
Yeah, that was 1975. Utility rates, too high or too low, question mark.
Well, that was the good question. And
Yeah.
the answer was it depends. And again, the very short version, this was something that was created because the political writers and I liked each other. This is a big political issue. So we said, we'll just do a series about this stuff. So, okay, and I'll do the utilities and they'll do the politics. And then there was someone else introduced and we'll let it go. So the whole series comes out. And there's one story in there by somebody, and I warned them, this is full of mistakes. But, this is someone above me in the food chain. He couldn't possibly make mistakes. So you end up with this series with this massive retraction because it was wrong. So in the end, I won the Loeb Award for my part of this. And since we didn't submit the series, I was the only winner. The political guys won the thing for the best political story of the year. And I'm sitting there one day and this message, or I can't even remember if it was a phone call or a letter, comes from the Loeb people. And it says here, first of a series. Will you send us the whole series? So I go talk to people in the newsroom and we sent them the series, and I insisted on sending them the retraction as well.
Yeah.
Because that was the honest thing to do. So I came home, told Nancy, well, I was going to win this prize, but it's gone. And then I won it. I was astounded. But, so I had this reputation, I had this prize. Nobody in New York would touch me. Nobody.
And why do you think that was?
They didn't know who I was. They didn't care. I didn't have connections. I didn't have a fancy college degree. But a fellow named Noam Pearlstein, I was just reading about my notes about this, mentioned me to a fellow named Jim Michaels, James Walker Michaels, who is the legendary editor of Forbes, the best editor I've ever seen, or no offense to you, Andy, or ever will see. And his thing was, he was very unconventional. He took big chances, and he figured, well, he'll get me there. He'll pay my moving expenses, and if he doesn't like it, he'll throw my butt out. What's he got to lose? And they didn't pay me very much, but they gave me the break in New York, and nobody else would do it. And I'm eternally grateful to Jim for that.
Did it seem like, so did Norm get to know you because of the Loeb Award or something like that?
I don't even know. I don't remember how this started, and I didn't even remember that he played a part until I was getting ready for this, reading my obituary that Fortune let me write about Jim Michaels, who was one of their primary competitors, which I thought was a class act to let me write this.
Yes.
And were you the editor? You didn't edit that, did you?
I don't think so. No.
No, but so I was reading this in my story. I'd forgotten it all. So, Jim hired me, and he was a really grouchy guy. And I used to go around imitating him, imitating his voice. And one day after I left, after some big argument, and stormed out at like 10 o'clock, taking the train home, midnight, the phone rings in my house, and my wife picks it up. And there's this guy on the phone, and she says, well, Mr. Michaels, he isn't home yet. Because she knew who it was, because I had imitated his voice. But it all worked out. We ended up, with all of these kids. Jim gave me a chance. And when in New York, suddenly I realized you can change jobs without changing cities.
Yeah, right.
So that's what I used to do.
Yeah, I'll get into that. So I want to ask you to, first of all, let me tell our audience that you guys can ask questions, and we can take them later, but we can also just take them as we go along. So if you have anything, don't save it to the end, just perk up, I think, put it in the chat, and I'll see it. and hope to ask Allan your questions. So please go ahead. But I want to drill down into something you said about, you said why you didn't go into business and banking, but what is it that you really love about being a journalist, and specifically a business journalist?
Well, I love being able to explain to people what's going on in the world that they should know. And because of my training, my joke was, I was a straight A economics student. And the bright people would ask, well, how many courses did you take? And the answer was one. Okay, but a lot of people weren't bright enough to ask that.
Right.
So I was good at that, and I was good at explaining things because I needed to explain them to myself because I had never learned them. If this makes any sense.
Yeah.
I had to figure this stuff out myself, with help from colleagues and sources. But I wasn't some guy, from the ivory castle writing about business. I was this guy from Brooklyn, figuring the stuff out and writing it and explaining it to people. So to tell people what's going on with their utility rates, why, their taxes are going up, or something I actually wrote this year, or I guess it was last year at the Washington Post, where I had a new valve put on my aorta. And I wrote a piece about that because I wanted people to know how this worked and that it wasn't scary. And, the doctors were so excited that I wrote this in English. And I suspect a number of people who wouldn't have had the surgery have had it because I explained in simple English what it was and why there's no reason to be afraid of it.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing I love to do. I just love to explain it. How do you handle an IRA? I mean, I learned these things, and because I learned them as a civilian, I can explain them as a civilian.
Allan, I mean, a lot of times people break up what we do into two parts, which is reporting and writing. Some people they say, oh, I'm, a great, or we say about other people, they're a great reporter, not a great writer. Some people are great writers, not great reporters. Some people, the best people are both. What do you think about yourself? Have you ever thought about that?
I'm sorry.
Are you a better reporter than you are a writer? Are you great at both?
I don't look at it that way.
Yeah.
I don't separate that out.
Mm-hmm.
I am what I am. I can figure stuff out. I can actually work well with others, despite, my character, my Brooklyn characteristics. And I just love figuring stuff out and explaining it.
So that sort of speaks to where you ended up, which is, it sounds like your skill set and what you're comfortable doing lends itself best to being a columnist. Is that right?
Right. And that's what I thought. And it took me a long time to get a column.
Right.
Because columns, Forbes didn't want me to have a column. Okay. I love Jim Michaels to death. I used to this was back during the days of, you would type something out and he'd scroll things in it. And I would take his edits. I'd have the copy desk make Xeroxes of his edits and take them home and study them and reverse engineer them.
Yeah.
Which accounts for much of my style, because a lot of what I do is what Jim Michaels would have done, in similar circumstances.
Were they hard? Were they elliptical? What were they hard to figure out? You couldn't read his handwriting? What do you mean?
Well, no, what I mean is, he'd write. No, I was very lucky because he liked me and seemed to have a certain amount of respect for me. And he realized I wasn't afraid of him.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't afford to be afraid of anybody. But he would write, do this, do that, fix this, fix that, this is wrong. And he would always cut it.
Right.
And I figured, well, hell, if he can figure this out, I can figure this out. So like I said, I reverse engineered him, picked up some of his techniques and adopted them. And that's why I'm much more comfortable being a columnist than anything else. And also my columns, as you may remember, are relatively short.
Yes. I remember there was an instance where you turned a short one in. and gotten an award for it.
Well, right. That was my final Loeb Award.
Yeah.
Which, and it turns out, I checked with the Loeb people. There were three of us who won Loeb Awards after our Lifetime Awards,
Yeah.
which is, I guess, like, well, we won't figure out what that is. And one was Carol Loomis,
Yes.
one was Walt Bogdanich,
Right.
and the other one was me. So I write this thing. I was on the Loeb committee. I told all of you guys I'm on the damn Loeb committee after getting the Lifetime Achievement Award. I don't want to be entered again. I don't want to make people uncomfortable. But Fortune entered the thing anyway. And the first I knew it had been, and never told me, the first I knew it had been entered is when it showed up as a finalist.
Yeah.
And I said, what is this? And the thing I remember most about that story is it came in 500 words under the assigned length.
Yeah.
And, people said, well, why don't you write 500 more words? And I said, no, I'm done. I've said what I have to say. I don't want to make it any longer.
You're the only reporter or writer to ever say that, by the way, as far as I could tell. But I want to ask you about some other stories. We have some questions coming
Sure.
in. One that I'm curious about, which was your second Loeb, and I don't really know what it was about because the headline is a little enigmatic to me, which is "Full Speed Ahead, Damn the Torpedoes."
Who did I write that for? I'm trying to remember.
You wrote that for Forbes. You don't remember either. Forbes, Howard Rudnitsky.
Oh, that wasn't no. Okay, that was about one of these banks.
Okay.
Some West Coast bank, and Howard was a much better analyst than I was.
Saying something.
Well, it's true, but I was a better writer, and we meshed beautifully because, again, he wasn't afraid of me, I wasn't afraid of him. We wrote the stuff together, and it was fun. And while we're at it, I want to show you something that he and I both wrote that probably should have won the Loeb but didn't. And it was the first thing anyone ever wrote about Mike Milken. Do you remember? Junk bonds.
Yeah, hold it up right next to your head. There you go. Yeah. Look at that, a cartoon cover.
Right, because I wanted people to read these things. I wanted them. I'm writing this for the audience. I'm not writing this for journalists. I'm not writing this for judges. I'm writing this for an average person like me. And this is the only cover line I ever got. It said Mike Milken's Marvelous Money Machine. And these are people Milken is cranking this thing, and the people around it with the major junk bond players. And it was great. We had a lot of fun. Milken hated it, which was good.
What year was that, Alan?
Wait a minute. 1984.
Yeah. I want to go through some of these comments. Some are comments and some are questions.
Okay.
So first of all, someone wanted me to ask you about your home repair talent, which maybe we'll get to. Rich Eisenberg says he worked with you and he's a big fan. Thanks. And then Howard Covington says you were modest about your work in Charlotte. Before he left, his stories had Duke Power rewriting its annual report over profits from real estate acquired under eminent domain. Not bad for a business writer by default. Thank you for that, Howard. And then Stephanie Mehta, hi Stephanie, asked, can Alan tell the story behind, and this is one of your favorite stories, the story behind the corporate killers Newsweek cover?
Right, which is this.
Yes. What is that about? Tell us all.
That is about these creeps. I'm sorry. I guess CEO doesn't stand for creepy executive officer. It stands for chief executive officer. And these were companies that did what were called inversions. And they left the United States, legally, but not in any other way, and were foreign companies and paid far less taxes than the equivalent American companies. And Hank Gilman and I, came up with this idea. I never in this lifetime would have dared put a cover like that on. Look at this. How would you like to be on this?
Who's on? What people? Who are those gentlemen?
Okay, one is the guy from Digital. I don't know who it was. Then there's Al Dunlap, whom you may remember from Scott Paper, the late Bob Allen of AT&T, and someone from IBM. These are guys who, I'm sorry, these weren't about inverters. That's a different column. These were about people who fired thousands of employees, to get the quarter's earnings up, and it was just hateful.
Right.
Just hateful. And Hank hated it, and I hated it, and a lot of people hated it. And we just went through and figured out how to explain this. This was one of my, and the thing that Howard Covington mentioned, which I have to say I'd forgotten, was I had found this secret subsidiary the Duke Power Company had that was into land development, and somehow all of the expenses went to the ratepayers and the profits went to the shareholders. And I figured this out, and the Public Service Commission in North Carolina had never heard of this until they read about it in the paper.
Right.
So Duke didn't like me very much, and what Duke did is it sent warnings when they said, "Thank God he's leaving, he's going to Michigan." They sent warning letters to the utilities in Michigan saying that here's what's coming, watch out. And one of the smarter utilities, I won't say which one it was, decided, well, hell, if this guy's so bad, let's be his buddy. So they call the paper, I'm not there yet. And the bitch senator says, well, wait a minute, how do you know he's coming? And they tell us all about these letters from the Duke Power Company. These warning things.
Wow, unbelievable.
And I made them pay for that, not journalistically, but in a one-on-one confrontation later, years later, I made them pay for that behavior because they could have told me they were doing it. They thought I'd never find out.
That's crazy. I mean,
so they didn't like me, and my going away picture, from the Free Press is a picture of me leaning on the Irvin Building.
Right.
Wow. So I'd bring that down, but Nancy would get upset. So I won't take it off the wall and show it.
I think actually, speaking of Detroit, Jack Ferry wanted me to ask you a little bit more about your time there and your coverage of the auto industry, and how did the auto industry or your exposure to it shape your business coverage going forward?
Well, actually, I did one intelligent thing in Detroit. I said, I don't want to write about the auto industry. There are a zillion people writing about the auto industry. They've been there forever. I want no part of it. I mean, I was happy to help other people, parse the financials, but I didn't write about the auto industry because I had no competitive advantage in writing about the auto industry. So I wrote about everything else because, and occasionally I'd write a piece about the auto industry, but I don't think any of them were memorable, and I don't remember any of them. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer, but
that's
I'm supposed to tell the
real
truth.
deal.
Right.
Yeah. You won a couple Loebs for columns, though, and then you started to hit your stride as a columnist, I think, in the 90s. You got your deals column in Newsday, won a Loeb. Your selected columns in 1998 at Newsweek won a Loeb. So how did you finally get into this groove of being a columnist at those places?
What happened was I left Forbes and went to Newsday, became a columnist, and sort of worked it out and worked out how to do it and how to write a column. And there's actually a mistake in Wikipedia where it says I wrote a syndicated column. Actually, what I ended up writing was a self-syndicated column.
How's that?
Well, for reasons, again, we won't go into, I took a huge pay cut when I went from Forbes to Newsday. And I professionally, I thought I had to do it. And college was coming. I figured someone's got to pay for college. But after the first 2 years, I was back to my regular salary. And we said, okay, we'll sell the column. And no syndicate wanted it, just like nobody wanted me in New York. No syndicate wanted my column. I said to the paper, why don't we sell it ourselves and, split the money? Well, we've never done that. So I said, well, then the rights must be worthless. And they said, that's right. I said, give them to me. And they said, okay. So I wrote a letter giving me the rights. They signed it and sent it back. And within, I think, a month, Marty Baron, do you remember him from the Washington Post? He used to be the business editor at the Los Angeles Times. He bought my column. He was my founding customer of my syndicate. The Washington Post bought it. Hank Gilman bought it at the Boston Globe. And all of this money now was mine because they'd given me the rights. And that's how we paid for college. And I told my children, if you ever run into Marty Baron, which I figured would never happen, he's the guy who made it possible for you to go to college without taking on debt. So in my goodbye dinner from Fortune, were you there? The
I was not
dinner?
there. No.
Well,
I left.
anyway, for reasons, again, we won't go into, there turned out to be 3 hosts. There was Fortune. I mean, Fortune paid for it. I let them do that. But there was Marty Baron and Paul Steiger. And Paul Steiger is, the longtime Wall Street Journal guy. So 2 of my children, who are like me, only worse, they were speaking at this thing, and each of them thanked Marty for making it possible for them to go to college.
Wow. How did Marty respond?
I don't know, but from what I've heard, it was the biggest smile anyone's ever seen from him. He was so happy because he had no idea this was coming. I had no idea it was coming. And that was the thing. That was, and Paul was great, and Marty, it was a very nice dinner, and then I left, and that was it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And at least I stuck Fortune with the tab for the taxi, and that was our last relationship. It was not a bad way to go.
Yeah. That's incredible. What a full circle that is. So a bunch of people are asking about Dina Kessler, favorite place that you worked. Chris Rauch.
Kessler is wait a minute. Dina Kessler is my daughter.
Okay. Hi, Dina. So Marty Baron paid for your school.
Well, he got it started.
Why is she
started?
She allowed to ask questions? Sure, she can. And then also, there she's thanking Marty again. Chris Rauch wanted to know what other journalists. So, what places did you like the most? And Chris Rauch wants to know what other business journalists have you enjoyed working with the most or admired?
Well, I enjoyed working with Hank Gilman. I enjoyed actually working with you. I don't know if you remember, but you and I have our name on a cover story in Time magazine.
Yes, we co-wrote a story for Time magazine, a cover story.
A cover story. I don't remember what it was, but I remember that we did it.
Was it about tax inversions?
I don't know. I don't remember.
It about like the companies, setting up their headquarters overseas? Was that it? Or was that a Fortune story? I don't know.
I'm not sure. I'm just not sure.
Okay.
That was a Fortune story.
Oh, okay.
But,
all right,
I liked Rudnitsky. I like a lot of the people I worked with. And I liked the Detroit Free Press, and I would have stayed there, but we had personal reasons to leave. Excuse me. We needed to go. I had a lot of fun at Forbes the second time around that I was there, but it was time to go. I wanted to be a columnist. I saw problems coming at Forbes, and unfortunately I was right. And it was just time. I liked a lot of the places I was, but what I did was I never fell in love with an employer. And I don't know if you ever remember this, but at one point when I was at the Free Press and we were having contract problems and all of that, I said, well, why don't I go on offense? Because every day they're worried about us is a day we don't have to worry about them. And I went to the annual meeting, shareholders meeting, because I was a shareholder. And there were big things. Send Sloan to the annual meeting, fundraising and all of that. And I get there, and my first question is, when the free press is struck and closed in June, what will the impact be on earnings per share? And they go crazy. They all get upset.
Yeah.
And after this, and I actually had a lot of faith in the integrity of John Knight, who was, of Knight newspapers. I thought he was a really class act, even though I disagreed with him. And we'd had sort of difficult exchanges of letters, but I had a lot of confidence in him. And I found out afterwards from friends of mine that the directors had demanded I be fired for this. And Knight said, "We don't do that here."
Mm. Mm.
Which, again, this is a really class act. And
Right.
it's not, I figured he would do that. And if he didn't, I would have figured out how to deal with it.
Right. Yeah. Greg Miles wants to know if you think that all the financial coverage in recent decades has changed corporate behavior for the better. Are we holding these companies more accountable, or are they more concerned so they're behaving better or not?
I suspect, again, that's another question that's never entered my mind. That's an example of why I was never an editor.
Right.
That's a good editor's question. It never occurred to me to ask it. I suspect that some of it has changed behavior, and some of the stories about obscene payments to chief executives may have changed behavior. I think some of it has changed.
Okay, so by the way, Cesar.
Oh, and then of course there was Enron. Remember that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, that didn't work out very well, did it?
No.
And that sort of changed behavior.
Cesari, I think I'm saying your name right, put in a cover shot of our story in Time Magazine, which is
Thanks,
How
Cesare.
Wall Street Sold Out America by the two of us. And oops, I got my name first because it was alphabetical, but you did all the work, I'm sure. I remember with Allan Sloan, you have to spell it right. There's two L's. And I remember you telling me the story that when a certain head of the Federal Reserve told you that you were lucky that your mother gave you two L's, and you were flattered that he told you this story because he was an Allan also. But then you found out that he told everyone that story.
Right. He was an ALAN.
Right.
That was a cheap, economical Allan.
Right.
I got the full-bodied Allan. And then there's an ALLEN, which I think is suitable only for last names, but I don't want to upset any of our audience here.
Yeah.
So if there are any ALLEN Allens, okay, I take it back.
A couple people want to know what your biggest mistake was, or a mistake that you made, anything you regretted.
All right. The biggest mistake I made was not keeping up with people, which I really should have done. I mean, that's my biggest.
Was not what? I'm sorry?
That's my biggest mistake, was I should have kept up more with people whom I'd written about than I did. I anticipated this question because, I would ask it. I don't remember any huge retractions, any huge embarrassments. I just remember various pieces of sloppiness. Like, for instance, in my Turkey column, the recent one, I mentioned ProPublica, but I forgot to say ProPublica, what ProPublica is. A not-for-profit newsroom that has done some very good stories. That's a kind of mistake. I looked at that and said, "What? How could I not have mentioned that?" That's the kind of thing that really annoys me and that I should do better at. And after 50-something years, I'm still trying. But I don't remember any horrible mistakes. I remember, having some retractions, but not of major things. And one of the things I did when I became a columnist was I insisted on correcting mistakes, immediately, and not whining about it. And at the end of the year, back when I was a free agent and could do what I wanted, I would do a self-analysis pointing out mistakes of omission. Things I should have done and didn't. Those are mistakes.
Right.
But they're not the kind of thing you're looking for. At least I don't think that's what we're looking for.
Well,
Well,
anyway, no,
whatever.
that's a great answer. There was some story about a bar mitzvah picture.
Wait a minute, Nancy, do you have that? Wait a minute.
Nancy, did you hide that one? Because
Okay.
I hope not.
No, what happened
Right, go ahead.
one day, Nancy finds this bar mitzvah picture of mine, which is retouched and sort of awful. And I happened to mention it in, you'll forgive me, the men's room of Newsweek to the editor, who was in an adjacent urinal.
Okay, that's a lot.
And I said, he said, well, why don't you bring it in? We'll figure out some way to print it. I said, that's crazy. But anyway, but here it is. And what I ended up doing, here's the picture. Isn't it lovely?
It's lovely. You did have more hair. I want to see a hippie picture though.
Well, I don't think any of those exist. And what I did was I wrote a story about how I'd gotten some stock in something called Rochester Telephone for my bar mitzvah, and I, had to sell it to be able to afford to move to move, but there were dividend reinvestment shares I'd forgotten about, and they kept piling up, and then it became this and it became that. And do you remember Global Crossing?
Yeah.
Well, I looked at Global Crossing. I said, this company is a pile of manure. It's going bankrupt. I told everybody I knew who might own it, get rid of this crap. And who do you think didn't get rid of it? Me.
Bingo.
Me.
How come?
I didn't get rid of it because I felt an emotional attachment to my bar mitzvah, which is, I have to say, idiotic. But I went and hunted around and found somebody who explained to me this is common behavior.
Wait a minute, you hung on to the stock because for emotional reasons? I mean, Jason Zweig, I think, is on the call. I think Jason's written like 7 columns on that, like that you shouldn't hold stocks for those kind of reasons, right? Jason, are you here with me? Go ahead.
Well, anyway, I just looked at the story. Someone named Terrence Odian, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing right. And I don't remember how I found him, or someone suggested I go there. But, I was telling him this, and he said, well, it's not as if you're the only person who's done this. This happens all the time because people get these irrational connections to things. And that's what happened with me. And I thought that was worth writing. And the headline, which I'd like to think I wrote, but I'm sure I didn't, it was called My Own Private Enron.
Ooh, yeah.
I don't know who wrote that, but whoever it is deserves praise.
I think that was a reference to My Own Private Idaho. I don't know if you're familiar. That's a B-52 song. I'm
sorry, I didn't know.
Well, I think maybe some people on the call can attest to that. I think that's what that was. But anyway, that's great. Did you have was there another story that you wanted to talk to that we didn't get to?
Well, it was this one.
Oh, right.
Because look, if you think about this, I've showed you covers from Forbes and Newsweek and Fortune. How many people have done that? How many people are crazy enough to have done things like that? And this was a thing about these creepy guys moving, quote, their headquarters overseas, dodging millions of dollars of taxes, but wanting to be considered American.
Right.
Which just enraged me.
Right.
And I don't remember where the story came from or who originated it. Was it you?
I think it was the two of us talking.
That sounds like the kind of thing we would have done.
Yes.
And so I mean, I love the cover. I have 1 million copies of this. They're available cheap.
Yeah.
I have the world's supply of covers.
And by the way, kudos to all the graphic designers. You were talking about that Milken cover, all the artists and graphic designers and infographics people who made all of your stories look great too, right?
Oh yeah, and I would go around and thank them and treat them like human people and buy them coffee and give them food because they're out there making me look good, but nobody knows who they are, outside of their narrow niche. And I wanted to show appreciation.
Yeah.
And I've always done that.
Right. No, absolutely. And that was I like that cover too. Matt Boyle, hi Matt, says here that we used to have a feature at Fortune where we asked business leaders what was the best advice they ever got. So what was the best advice you ever got about journalism or maybe life, and who gave it to you?
Well, the best advice I ever got about journalism was from Jim Michaels, may he
Mm,
rest in peace. And it's not what he told me, it's what he didn't tell me.
mm,
Um, I saw his style, I saw what he had accomplished, and I figured there was a way to do the same things, but to be less nasty about it, personally, and to smile and do the same things he did, but I would do it with a smile.
mm.
And he would scream and get upset, and I did it with a smile. And, the best advice I've ever gotten about life is from Nancy, my wife, who has kept me relatively sane for all of these years and, tried to stop me from, letting my darker and crazier impulses reign. And, but, I never sat around and talked about journalism. I never did any of this. I was busy. I needed to get home to see my wife and kids. If you remember, on Fridays, I mean, we're Jewish, and I'd want to get home for Friday night dinner,
Mhm.
including times where I would go home for Friday night dinner to New Jersey and then come back. But, I was very into being home and having, getting my work done, but still having a family life because I thought that was important.
Yeah.
Because I was working to have a family, not the other way around. I didn't have a family so I could work more. I worked so I could have a family.
Mm.
Um, so, I mean, that's the kind of thing I used to do. I'm sorry. Again, I'm not classic. I got into journalism by accident. A lot of the things I wrote that turned out to be memorable were things that we just stumbled on because
Yeah.
that's how it is.
Right. Just a couple more, Alan. This is great. Um, and maybe going back to that turkeys, I think someone wanted to know this, and it's a good thing. It was on my mind as well. I'm sorry I couldn't find who asked this question, but your favorite turkeys, I guess, which is akin to your favorite bad guys, or people who really stuck in your craw, or something along those lines.
Right.
Right.
I mean, that was the whole Enron thing. There were these guys. What was his name? This terrible person. Hold on a second. Um,
Which one?
well, there were so many.
I know,
Uh,
right?
I can't even remember. Um, well, these sort of oldish guys who were part of Milken's crew, and Milken and I, bizarrely, we were once forced into the same room and told not to come out till we had a deal
Huh.
because there was somebody who may rest in peace, who you know Michael liked a lot and I respected. Whoops, his name was Abe Spiegel, and
Mm,
he was the father of one of the people on the merry-go-round. And Abe and I would speak Hebrew to each other, and he was a double Holocaust survivor, and
mm,
he got tired of hearing Michael complain about me and me complain about Michael, and locked us up in a room and said, "Don't come out until you have a deal."
mm. Wow.
And and we had a deal for a while, but it fell apart. It just couldn't last. But Michael had a lot of decent characteristics to him, including once we had this bizarre thing where my family, whose children were roughly the same ages as his children, we visited him at home, and one of my daughters, who's now a federal regulator, ended up getting two desserts out of him, and when I called them up, told I said, Michael's going to jail. He lost his case. He's going to jail. My children cried
Wow.
because they liked him. I because they had seen him as a human being at home. That was our only relationship with him. And at home as a human being, he was terrific.
Right. Have you seen him recently in his, reincarnated state as a philanthropist?
No, no, I mean, we have nothing really to talk about.
Interesting.
But he had a lot of interesting, sides to him that you wouldn't know unless you got to see it. And
Right.
and for that I owe Abe Spiegel, may he rest
Got
in
it.
peace.
Final question, Alan, and I think this comes from a family member, but it also comes from me, and that is, and we're not family, not that I know
I
of.
hope not. That's
What do you see as your legacy? What do you want people to remember you as starting now?
I want them to remember me as somebody who tried to help other people, without being, what's the word? Without being sentimental about it, without asking people to, gee, aren't I great? I'm helping you. That's what I like my legacy to be. And I'd like also to have a journalistic legacy of showing that you can start with nothing, journalistically, and make something of yourself, which is what Nancy and I did. We started with nothing financially, we started with nothing professionally, and we've done very well. So it can be done, and that's the message I would like people to have.
That's fantastic. Well, on that note, why don't we wrap things up? Alan, thank you. It's just a pleasure. I always love talking to you. This has been one of our more extended conversations, and it just happened to be a public one, but I really, really enjoyed it. So keep it going on, Alan. Caleb, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. You were the perfect person to host this conversation, and we so appreciate you. And again, one day you'll be sitting on that side of the screen, and I look forward to that. But Allan Sloan, you are a total legend. Andy said you are the GOAT of our industry when it comes to someone who is so dedicated to business journalism, so dedicated to really helping other people. But to think the people that you help are not just those who read your stuff, who got to edit your stuff, but also the people that got to work alongside you. I had the good fortune of doing that for a few minutes in my career, and I'm really blessed. And I think everybody who did feels better off from it. And again, please continue to do the awesome work. You're exactly what we are all about here at SABEW, and we are honored to honor you. So thank you.
Well, bless you for the compliments, and bless you for this. And Andy, maybe in a few years, I'll get to ask you the questions. That should be that's how it should be.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. This is the Legends of Business News series from SABEW. This is what we're all about. This is what we're proud of. Again, a little plea here. It is Giving Tuesday. It is the giving season. If you can't give to us, give to somebody. But if you'd love to give to SABEW, we would appreciate it. Easy to do at sabew.org on our donate button, and we'd appreciate that. For all of you, please, thanks again for joining us. Have a happy holiday season. Be healthy, be safe. Thank you, Allan Sloan. Thank you, Andy Serwer. We will see you guys next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alan.